Mm.
Hey everybody, this is Varun and Nisha with the Edge podcast for CHROs. This is the second episode that we're doing with Dr. Sanna here, who's a guest for this episode. So this episode right now is going to deal with a lot of behavioral science questions, and we're going to be deep diving into how the psychology has changed of you and I, of every work of every human's pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic, right? And we're going to try and distill that into actionable playbooks that a modern CHRO can use while probably doing the engagement planning for the coming year, or how to essentially make the workplace much more easily, in terms of the mindset, in terms of the mindset that's happening, how to really make that a more welcoming place both for introverts, for extroverts, for all types of people, right? So in the last episode, Nisha and I spoke to Bhagya Sri Pancholi, who's founder of All Remote, and so we spoke a lot about how the tax structure and all the compliance varies from country to country, from place to place, and essentially how the work from home, work from anywhere, and remote working are different words that we often use interchangeably, and how all of these words are essentially lines in sand that I think we should all be wary of nuances, especially when we are trying to hire people from across the world. So I'll take a moment to introduce Dr. Sanna right now. So Dr. Sanna is a behavioral scientist who is passionate about sharing insights from psychological science and analytics to improve the quality of people's lives. She advises both public and private sector clients how they may best systematically use behavioral science as a transformatory tool for policy and provision of services and product design. So in her research, she essentially focuses on personality science and individual behavior change. Her research examines the mechanisms that link psychological traits to a variety of outcomes, and how to go about planning and mitigating risks that come with individual behavior change. So she received her PhD in social psychology from the University of Cambridge. Her research has been featured in global media outlets, and she regularly speaks at conferences. You'll find all of her information again linked in the post of this podcast as well once this goes out. Feel free to reach out to her, and definitely do hit the like button, please. It really matters to us. Nisha, I'll leave that. I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Varun. And I think what I'd like to do is just say thanks to Dr. Sana as well. Dr. Sana, do you have anything to tell us before we actually start?
No, firstly, thank you for having me, and secondly, I think I'm really excited to be talking about this just because the future of the workplace post pandemic is something on everyone's minds, and especially when it comes to our own behavior, our own personality, and the shifts that have been taking place. We all have kind of stories to share, so I think it's great that we're talking about this today.
Awesome. I guess since you mentioned stories, right, do you want to start with some of the stories that probably held your attention most during this, during, I think we've just completed a year of the
Yeah.
pandemic and this new life that we have been living. So, do you have any interesting stories to share? Some that probably looked very commonplace, but some that were really edge cases to you?
Yeah. And this was all the time last year that we thought the pandemic would last a couple of weeks long. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, I think as a psychologist and particularly as a personality scientist, I think for me, this has been one of the most interesting years in terms of my professional career, but also personally. And I think when I think about a story, it's really comes down to the impact of social isolation, the impact of social distancing on individual behavior. And as you said, Varun, like we thought this would last, a couple of months, and the fact that it has lasted a year, and the just understanding the impact of that on individual behavior. Psychologists are still trying to piece everything together because we've never experienced this before. But what has really kind of interested me, and it's only now that we're starting to kind of gather data around this, and it's going to be an ongoing thing for psychologists, is how introverts and extroverts particularly, and when I talk about personality, I can talk about a whole host of personality. I also talk about people who are more kind of emotionally sensitive and anxious, and the impact of social isolation and the pandemic on them. But introverts and extroverts, I think, particularly are relevant to the workplace, and how they are coming out of this pandemic, and what are the kind of behavioral shifts that have happened for both introverts and extroverts. Is something that I'm really interested by. Also, just because of the personal kind of anecdotes that we're hearing Normally, when we talk about introverts and the workplace, introverts have always been traditionally kind of a disadvantage. Because the workplaces that, especially in kind of Western cultures, they're kind of geared towards the extrovert advantage is what psychologists, call it. And so the 9 to 5 in the office, that traditional structure, has typically kind of lauded in extrovert behavior. And so what we saw during the pandemic is suddenly kind of introverts are coming out and say, they're able to work from home, which is all that introverts have wanted for some time, and suddenly they're the ones who are able to manage this better than extroverts. And that's something that I've been really interested by, like the kind of reverse extrovert advantage, and what that impact has been. And we're only, as I said, now coming out of this pandemic, how are these different personality types adjusting to it?
Right, it's very interesting actually. But I also believe that beyond all of this, right? All of us, to some extent, introvert or extrovert, have developed some kind of anxiety. I really can't put my finger onto it. It's very difficult for me to kind of imagine what this is. But like I was telling you earlier, Dr. Sana, I don't feel like the same individual that I was. Um, and I also feel like, um, since we're talking about getting back to work, I can't imagine me being the same kind of individual at work, and delivering in the same way. Although I don't necessarily think that is anything to do with productivity, because I don't think that there has been a dip there. It's just the individual, it's just my individuality, probably I would say, that has changed. Or me being the individual that I am has possibly changed a little bit. So uh, can you kind of help us understand what has this psychological change really been in each one of us, right? And why this anxiety, and and especially for a CHRO then, right? I mean, what does this translate to for an organization of 50 people, or 500 and 5,000 people, this kind of new anxiety that has really developed?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of points there. I think firstly, we've gone through trauma, right? This pandemic is essentially a traumatic event that we collectively as societies have gone through. And so there is naturally going to be an impact on that. Whether you are, regardless of your personality type, we have gone through something that is unprecedented. So I think it's quite natural that we're in this state where, as you mentioned, right, you just don't feel like you're the same person again. I would add the caveat that, or kind of bring in some research here, that, personality and behavior personality is relatively stable over time. Like, we do experience kind of minor shifts, and we can change our personality. That's kind of research that's come out in the last kind of 10-15 years, that we can, an introvert can tweak their introversion, become a bit more extroverted if a situation demands it or a role demands it. But our personality tends to remain quite stable. And I think with the fact that this pandemic has been kind of over a year now, and of course there are extreme cases, I think that we are still in a kind of recovery phase. But I think that as life kind of returns to normal, we are going to find ourselves, and it might take time. And again, I can't put how long it would actually take, but I think we will find ourselves going back to those individual behaviors. But it is going to take all of society returning to normal, I think, not just our workplaces, in order, and again, what is normal is something that we could discuss, but I think we're going to find ourselves kind of going back to previous kind of behaviors. I think when it comes to what CHROs should know, I think it's mental health is going to be an absolute priority now. And I think, we talk about well-being and employee well-being, and we've talked about that for some time, but I think the fact that this pandemic has affected people so much in terms of loneliness, in terms of stress, anxiety, burnout, I think more than ever, organizations are going to have to focus on mental health initiatives and make that a priority going forward.
So, Dr. Sanna, on that note, right, in terms of mental health initiatives, let me give you like the lay of the land that happens, right? And you can sort of help us refine that a bit more. Normally, one you in cases where you've got good managers, it's very easy to have open-ended conversation with them by weekly retrospectives and really pour your heart out in terms of what worked, what ego issues happened, and all of those things, right? That's one thing. I would say I think about 5% of the entire workplace people, I mean the workplace population is lucky to have that. I don't think everybody has the luxury of a manager like that. That's one part. Two, in terms of giving, let's say lunches or any other perks that might come with the job, right? It could be, helping you setting up your home office with your home furniture, things that also help your mental health, but indirect way. But that's also important. Three, actually having a concierge desk with an in-house, psychologist or somebody of that sort, who you could probably have, a very again a very open-ended convo with something that's private as well. And third would probably be letting you actually work from any place, anywhere, like letting you do what you want, define your own work hours. So there are a lot of aspects to mental health, right? What do you think should be the priority in terms of this, in terms of perks, in terms of all of this that NOC can offer, essentially? Because let's also accept the fact that, look, every org, every CHRO also have their hands tied. And I think more than what all of us can imagine at this moment. So keeping that and keeping the realistic boundaries in mind, what do you think, what would your suggestions be on that?
Yeah, and I think those are all important suggestions. And with mental health, you have to take a multi-pronged approach. You can't just focus on one. But I think it actually, you have to kind of step back, I think, with this first, and identify whether your organizational culture is actually promoting um, vulnerability. Is it allowing for, you talked about leadership. Are leaders role modeling empathy and compassion and the importance of vulnerability? I think stepping back and first identifying whether that organizational culture is there and those values are there is going to be key, because otherwise, obviously flexible working is an important aspect of it. But if leadership is not promoting it, and if it's not there as kind of a core value within an organizational culture, these things are not really going to have much of an effect. And it's challenging, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, is creating that space for employees to feel vulnerable, and to be able to express that vulnerability. There's so the term psychological safety comes up a lot. And psychological safety is, I mean, originally when the term first came out, the concept was around teams that feel able to take risks. And effective teams are the ones where employees feel like they can take risks. But now what in our current climate, I think when we talk about psychological safety, we're talking about the safety of employees to feel vulnerable, and to share their feelings. And that's going to be, I think, the main kind of priority, how to actually foster those conversations, and even more challenging, how to foster those conversations when people are not in the same office space. I think that's going to be really challenging.
So I really like the last part wherein you sort of drew the nuance between that happening in the office space and not in the office space as well. All right, now let's sort of deep dive a bit on this a bit more. You mentioned empathy, you mentioned vulnerability, you mentioned all of these things, which are of course important as well. But to get stakeholder buy-in, right, of orgs of, let's say, a startup, a mid-sized company, and probably proper established enterprise, right? All of the culture there across these places varies, and they have different ideas of empathy, different definitions of vulnerability in all these places. If you were to sort of help us understand how can we really bring vulnerability into sort of like a tangible outcome. For example, let's say that I'm a CHRO, and my one of my OKRs for this quarter is to really promote empathy within the org, within cross-functional teams. What would my KRAs entail? Would that mean me increasing more cross-functional work, helping, in sort of nudging managers, look, why don't you, help your ICs sort of work with more different ICs from different places, so that they can sort of, get to know each other a bit more, empathize with each other's workloads and bandwidths and all of those things. Would that also imply that, look, why don't I just have cross-functional town halls, or why don't I, do all sorts of things? So what would your recommendation be in that sort of a scenario? Like, if I'm the, if like I said, like, let me sum my question up. If I'm the CHRO, my empathy, my core, my KRA, sorry, my OKR for this quarter is to increase empathy and vulnerability among employees, increase workplace communication. What would my 5 KRAs be, and how would I sell that to a top management?
Mm.
I would just add 2 points to that. One is in a world that possibly is hybrid, right? Where people may
Yeah,
not
of
be
course.
coming into office every day. And the other thing, Dr. Sana, that I'm noticing a lot is that people are talking about mental health, not really encompassing empathy and vulnerability the way you are talking about it. They're talking about Zumba
Right.
sessions, and they're talking
Exactly.
about, I don't even know, right? I've switched off to some extent about
Self-care.
all these,
Yeah.
yeah, like these sessions where you have to be much more than who you are, right? You have to literally pretend to be somebody else because your organization suddenly being so nice to you and giving you all of these sessions, but to me they actually add pressure more than helping me be anything but calm, right? I mean, I'm not calm in these sessions, so
This is an important
with these
constraint that
caveats.
Nisha actually mentioned, in fact, because this is something that you had also brought out later, I mean, earlier as well, about introverts being able to tweak their personalities. And in such pressure type situations, they're forced to tweak it, and that might go against their nature, against the current. And that does not really fare well for a bunch of people, right? So, keeping the constraints, keeping the nuances in mind, how do you go about the question that I asked? Yeah.
Yeah. So firstly, it's a great question. And I think it is, I'm going to add the caveat that, we don't, none of these are tried and tested and we don't have evidence on them. So, I mean, I think what we do know is what doesn't necessarily work. And in the case Nisha, you brought this up with these kind of, I think the default for a lot of managers and leadership has been, okay, we need to increase connection, right? That's going to allow us to have these vulnerable conversations. So let's do kind of happy hours. Let's do kind of team wide like Zoom parties, and I'm a consultant. I work by myself, but I've heard about these kind of things from my friends. So I think that's been the default, but those are just, firstly, Zoom. We talked a lot. We've heard a lot about Zoom fatigue, which has become a little bit of like a catchword, but that is a reality. People are, these kind of events, these kind of initiatives on HR's part appeal to a certain personality types, but are not inclusive. And people have also got to the point where they're just not going to, those vulnerable conversations are not going to happen in a kind of a team-wide setting. So I think we need to rethink how we're doing this. And I think this is where personality is important, because it needs to be inclusive across personalities. And I think when FaceTime is not taking place, and I think there is a different conversation to be had when we are going into our offices, even if it is a couple of times a week. I think it's really going to be the manager employee relationship, which is our first starting point. And I think check-ins with where leaders are asking, and it's not just asking kind of how are you doing, because I think if you ask someone how they're doing, our general default response is going to be like, yeah, I'm fine, all fine. It's about really probing, asking the right questions, and making that making those check-ins regular, and with the kind of framing that this is an opportunity to really get into how are you coping, what's going on, and having those conversations across the team, also having kind of team conversations, but again, so that it's inclusive across personalities, not trying to do this all on Zoom with a team wide kind of situation. I think individual small groups is the way forward here, and I think that's a useful kind of starting point, having those regular check-ins to begin with.
So, you think would it be advisable to resurface Gallup strength tests and different personality tests and sort of get like a proper view of a person based on that, and then sort of start having conversations which are contextual to every person versus just randomly coming? Because some might find really that some might, because I think that a lot of people might find it intrusive that, look, you're coming and asking me a bunch of these things. I may not be okay with it because I want to differentiate my work world and my personal world. And given that this is in a way that we're trying to, if you see a Venn diagram, right, the hybrid sort of sits in between, and all of these personalities and your managers and your colleagues becoming your actual friends, and your friends again probably being friends as well, if they haven't stopped messaging you during the pandemic. A lot of mine have. So, but in given these scenarios, right, do you think it would make sense to really start for an organization to start from scientific tests like this and assess people based on that, and accordingly assign activities and things to them, which would also make it easier to manage? Would you think that would be a good way to go about things?
Absolutely. And this is what I've always advised kind of companies, that the importance of personalized initiatives when it comes to behavior in teams and personality in teams. I think there's always a bit of pushback, because then you don't want to be profiling your employees,
Right.
and you can quickly kind of, the dark side is there.
Yeah.
But I think as long as it's used for these kinds of initiatives, and in terms of kind of community building, trust building, leading with empathy and compassion, I think then an understanding, a nuanced understanding of personality is really important. And I think you raised a very good point, which is, for some people, they really want to have a very clear work personal life divide, and they don't want to be having these vulnerable, difficult conversations with their teammates or with their manager. It makes them uncomfortable. So we shouldn't be forcing, it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. We shouldn't be forcing that on people. But at the same time, I think just as a general principle, we do need to focus on allowing for and fostering vulnerability in this time, like post-pandemic, as we come out of the pandemic.
Interesting. So, do you have any examples of how possibly one can really do that in a work setting, Dr. Sanna? Is there something that you can share with us that could be like a nudge to a CHRO that this is how one can go about these conversations?
I don't have an example kind of top of mind. As I said, I think we typically we focused a lot pre-pandemic on team cohesiveness, on building trust building, community building in teams. I think the vulnerability conversation is very kind of new, and so I think in terms of giving you kind of evidence of this, I don't have anything kind of top of mind, but I think we're going to now start seeing a shift in this kind of taking center stage.
Yeah. I can share something interesting there. An experiment that we're running at work. Every Friday, say at 4 o'clock, while others are having no meeting Fridays, or the Zoom parties that you mentioned, what we do instead is we get to know each other better, right? Also because there are a lot of new employees that have joined us, I guess, and as an organization, we are growing. So what we've done is, actually, now that I think about it, it's a very interesting thing, right? So we're talking about who we are really, what have the tipping points in our life been, what have some of the milestones of our life been, and also what should people know about us, right? And that doesn't encompass anything that that doesn't just encompass the good things, right? It also talks about a lot of things that kind of tick you off, or you're not very happy with, and also sometimes you come across as a very different person because of your life situations. But what if somebody doesn't know that and starts judging you because of how you come across, and not really who you are and your background story, right? So I've just figured that having these conversations at work, I know we do it at Zoom, on Zoom, and we're not really sitting face to face, but what I have seen is that the impact is not any less, and if a story well told really touches the heart, and you really connect with that person, even if that person isn't sitting next to you, and that's something interesting that I have observed. But to take off from that, we're still a very small team. We're only 10 to 12 people, right? But for an organization to replicate this kind of a model in at scale, I believe not and the other thing I've also noticed is it takes for that kind of an individual to let you be vulnerable, and it also takes for a certain kind of individual to be vulnerable. You have to really be a very secure individual to be vulnerable, is what I have figured also. So what I'm really getting at is, for a CHRO, what would be the right questions to create that kind of an environment? What would be the right kinds of interventions at scale to, create these little spots for vulnerability? Can we even redefine productivity? Because we always talk of ourselves at work as zombies, that, oh, we have to get so much done. Can we cut ourselves a little slack at work, and redefine how we are as individuals at work? Dr. Sana, what would you add to this, and your perspective on this, please?
So yeah, Sana, please.
Just to, I think the productivity question is really interesting. I'll come back to that. I think just in terms of what you mentioned in your example of how you need to, and it comes back to what I was saying about asking the right questions. I think it's not about, as you mentioned, it's not about kind of discussing those kind of success, kind of happy kind of examples and stories. I think it's when you start asking people. So just to give you an anecdote, my supervisor during my doctoral research used to say that when he would ask a student how they're doing, and students in like exam kind of terms when there was clearly a lot of stress, instead of asking how are you doing, he would say, how are you doing really? And just kind of asking, adding the really to that would completely change the answers than the responses that he was getting. And so that's a just a nice example of how just the framing of a question can have such an impact. And so when we're having these check-ins, these conversations with our team, with our teams, it's about, as you said, it's sharing the failure, sharing the negative experience. I think a good example is sharing the kind of negative experiences of the last year, because we all have them. That's something that ties us all together, and I think that's a good starting point in having the conversation. How has it impacted our relationships? How has it impacted the way we see ourselves? Because as we talked about right at the beginning, our whole kind of self-concept has completely changed. Another point I just wanted to add when it comes to creating kind of allowing for these conversations, I think more than ever, we also need to create a kind of shared identity. And this is going to be very tricky because of the fact that we are no longer kind of all located in the same space. But how do you ensure that teams have that? Because this is one way to really foster that sense of kind of connection, is a shared identity and shared kind of goals, and feeling teams feeling that they are working towards the same kind of goals and a common purpose. So I think that's also going to come in as an important way to kind of create this culture.
Those are some very interesting points. So I have a couple of things to probe on this. Actually, one of the things is that so you mentioned the importance of conversations, and essentially framing it in a way that it doesn't come off as intrusive, and really having a space where people feel that they're a part of something bigger and they're all there for each other, right? So on that note, I'm sort of curious about one thing, right? How would you use contrasting as a preemptive tool? I mean, so I personally believe that this is the killer of all fundamental attribution errors and assumptions that we might have, especially given the fact that this is appraisal season going on and a lot of bridges might be burnt, a lot of things might go wrong, a lot of things might go right as well. So a bunch of nuances might happen. So it's very important, I think, for managers or even to peers while giving feedback to each other, especially now, because I think right now is the perfect hotbed for actually building the empathy and the the vulnerability aspect of our personalities and the entire org culture. So in terms of contrasting right now, for example, if I'm talking to you, if I have to give you the bad news that look, probably we might not be going ahead with you or any of these things, I'll probably anticipate how how you might assume the worst possible case scenario. Like I'd factor in their goals, I'd factor in your worst possible fears, and essentially I try to also interpret what is predictable in the sense that look, I know you might react this way, and if I start framing my sentence that look, hey, I'm not trying to really point fingers at you, but then your performance in the last quarter on so and so aspects weren't as good as we expected to be because of XYZ reason. Do you think that would be a good communication style that managers need to adapt to, which is more I mean, again, what are your thoughts on that though, using
Yeah.
essentially contrasting as a preemptive tool uh, for yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that this is something that should have, I mean, it should have happened before the pandemic, or you didn't need a pandemic to change this, and
Very good point.
enhance, the way
Yeah.
that we do performance reviews and appraisals. But absolutely, like we have to, that is the way forward. And if it's taken a pandemic to trigger that, I think it's a
It's pretty sad. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think one thing I just wanted to bring in is, I think it's going to be, just because performance appraisals made me think of kind of onboarding new, because the way that we've had this conversation, we're talking about existing teams, right? Full-time employees. And what happens, I think that a major challenge is going to be onboarding new employees, and for organizations that are expanding, this becomes even more challenging because we're remote. And how do you create and promote those values and those conversations when you've never met each other? And I think that's something that is also going to be a challenge. And
Right.
this is where, coming back to the hybrid model, as we come out of this pandemic, it my personal perspective on this is that remote working and entirely kind of remote working is not the best model. I do think that even if it is one day a week in the office, it is important, at least initially, to foster that kind of connection. And also, just to give another example, I think for women, this pandemic has had such an impact on women in terms of, and there's enough research to show that they've kind of taken on the majority of the burden, because they're also in many cases kind of managing their looking
Yeah.
after families. And so I think it's actually very important for women to be able to have an office to escape to, one with, even if it is once or twice a week.
So your point on, onboarding aspect, I think I really found that interesting. So I kind of want to share a case study, and I want your opinion on that. So again, I read this, I think, ages ago in one of the case in point books. So Wipro is, I think, one of the greatest textbook examples of culture, I feel, right? So it's one of the most successful call centers that was ever built, in my opinion. But in the late 2000s, right? Talking 2002, 2003, sometime around then. So as many as 50 to 70% employees were actually leaving the company within the first year. So the attrition rates were through the roof, right? And that kind of sucks for a call center, because that's pretty important, right? And then so they left for a myriad of reasons, right? But at the core, the leadership team sense that the employees sort of lacked a strong connection to the company. Like they lacked a sense of purpose, like you mentioned, like the shared vision, that the shared identity, right? That's something that they lack. So and the what Wipro did at that point in time was that Wipro started offering a ton of incentives, like giving like a short hike percentage every year, plenty of other benefits as well that come with your pay package. But that didn't also help either, right? So that's, we're talking about Wipro at that point in time, which is still a pretty big giant. And then so around this aspect, right? So this is one, when this is the time when sort of Wipro hired a consulting company to address this problem. I don't remember which consulting company it was, but they did. So what they did was that they took several hundred people, like new hires, essentially people who were getting trained the first week of training and all those things. They divided them into two different groups. All right. So one group, again, just got the standard lay of the land. Look, this is what we do. This is what you're supposed to do, and the standard training and stuff, right? No open-ended conversations, no shared identity, no vision statements. There was nothing, right? And then at the end of the session, they just got like a tour of the facility, and then they got answered some vanity questions, and they got a patted back with a sweatshirt. That was the standard stuff that Wipro did at that point in time. Uh, Group two also got the same sort of training, plus an additional hour, not focused on company, but on each individual, right? The trainers really essentially asked, what is unique you about what's unique about you, and what are the different traits that you bring into the workplace. What do you think makes you happiest about your performances at work? What really drives your best performance? Stuff like this, right? Things that really get somebody thinking. And the result, actually, like I think about 7 or 8 months later, was that the trainees from group 2 were actually 250% more likely to see their long-term careers at Wipro versus group 1, who were around 100 to 150% likely. So you can see that there's a huge percentage citizens. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that this actually works, not just for Wipro, but for a startup that's starting tomorrow, for a mid-sized company? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, as you were describing it, I remember this case study. I think it's, see, for human beings, we all want to feel recognized. Social recognition is such an important driver of well-being, of our productivity, and actively recognizing that. And there's some work around this called, and I think it's specific to onboarding, around signature strengths. So when onboarding employees, make sure that you have a conversation where you're identifying their signature strengths, because again, that taps into that need for social recognition. And when an employee is joining a company, it's so important for them to feel that their individual goals are going to kind of fall within the common goals and the common purpose of an organization. And I think that is absolute, like, I think that's just going to be a foundational kind of aspect of onboarding, of good onboarding practices in the future. And even so, whether it be remote, whether it be in the office, I actually think that's not going to matter. I think it's about that recognition and those conversations that are really going to be important. And I think with the goals, when it comes to recognizing one's own signature strengths, one's personal goals, it's also about bringing an employee through that individual conversation into what is the common purpose of a team, of an organization, because common purpose can transcend, geographical dislocation, right? It can be the glue that maintains a culture. And it's not about, those conversations, as you said, you get a tour of your office and it's like, okay, our values, our mission statement is this. It's got to be a little bit deeper than that. And it's only through conversation that you can really, get to that meaningful conversation.
So from what you're saying, that the onboarding experience, when you're actually hiring somebody, I think that's when you're essentially laying the seed of the future of the culture of your organization. So because you said that, again, I mean, let's face it, we might continue being remote permanently. We might be in a hybrid. We never know what's going to happen right now. So, but then we're also constantly going to keep hiring. The one thing that's sort of always been constant is that people are getting hired consistently. And given the fact that if I was CHR, I think my approach would be that, look, I'd probably set up new playbooks that would be more personalized. I'd probably ask them more about their own personalities, was just take a standard interview and take them through the standard TA process, and then essentially revamp it right there at the top of the funnel part, and then make sure that I'm sending these new much more jovial people into the org that can sort of start becoming little holes of sunshine. I'm romanticizing this a bit too much probably, but then this is what I sort of see it happening as. Nisha, what are your thoughts? Do you think this might be a good practice for CHROs to do it?
My thoughts are that anything done in moderation is good, in the sense that I love the point on personalization. I love Dr. Sana's point on how purpose will kind of be the glue for culture, right? And it can be the glue for culture um, anywhere. I mean, a remote culture, and that really has been intriguing me for a long time, right? What would remote culture look like? And you simplified it by just saying that it's just one brilliant, passionate purpose statement. But what I'm also thinking, Varun and Dr. Sana, is that while we're talking about all of this, how much of it will really translate, right? How much does the CHRO really, understand what, um, how much of a also reign are they given to change a lot of these things, right? Because there are the various structures of an organization, and not every organization is as progressive to some extent as we think it needs to be. And the other point is that somewhere we're still measuring, like, I mean, like we said, we'll talk about productivity. We're still measuring productivity the way we always used to mention. Measure productivity. So why aren't we changing the very intrinsic and the very basic things about us at work? And without that change, we expect everything else to change. I mean, why aren't we just bringing out these little skeletons from the closet and saying that, hey, we don't want you there anymore? Why can't we just shake this up?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we've been given an opportunity right now to completely kind of refresh and reset the way that we organize, the way that our organizations are structured. we talked about this for decades in terms of, how to revamp the performance appraisal system, what is productivity, how to have more meaningful conversations. I mean, we've basically been given this opportunity to completely kind of change the discourse around this, to completely change how we actually do this. And I think the concern that I have is that right now we're talking mostly about flexible working, because that's the most kind of obvious, that's the lowest hanging fruit here. And how are we now, the hybrid model, and how are we going to implement better flexible working practices if we go back to work? But why are we not, and this is exactly what you're saying, why are we not having conversations about what does productivity actually look like? How are we ensuring that common purpose, shared vision, human connection is really a foundational aspect of the way that we work? And those kinds of questions I think need to be addressed.
And also one other one I've noticed, Dr. Sana, is trust, right? I mean, early on in the pandemic, I remember a friend telling me that a lot of companies actually, um, had cameras or some way of actually snooping in, and figuring out if their employees are actually sitting for 8 or 9 hours in front of the laptop, right? I mean, luckily, I'm so glad that that changed really fast. But you can imagine how intrinsic lack of trust is, right, between an organization and the employee. I mean, all of us look at it as, oh my God, like, we don't trust our employer to have our best interest in mind. So why should we have their best interest in mind, right? Um, to some extent, I feel like that changed a little bit because, when we were working from home, we gave our best. I mean, we really gave our double best only because of guilt. I think at least being a woman, for me, double guilt. This guilt drives me, right? So I feel like, how should we normalize not feeling guilty? To some extent, how should we normalize the fact that I may not be my productive best every day, but the sum total of the outcome that I have produced has been so immense that nobody else could have done that. And therefore, I am valuable to the organization as much as the organization is valuable to me. So again, I'm bringing back this point on trust, right? And how should we connect as individuals, not really as organization versus employee, I think.
Yeah. It's hugely important. And I think what we saw early on in the pandemic, and this has been one of those, the argument against flexible working that circulated previously, is that, employees feel this pressure to be constantly visible and constantly on, so that they're proving to their employers and their managers that they are actually doing the work. That's fundamentally wrong, because that means that there is no trust, because there shouldn't be those things in place otherwise. And I think in order for, I completely agree. I think trust is one of the most important. We've talked about vulnerability. I think trust is another, like, hugely important currency now. And I think it really is about agency, and it's about employers, HR. It's about giving employees that sense of agency, that we trust you, and you will do the work that you need to do, and fulfill kind of your responsibilities, and not having this kind of big brother-esque attitude kind of to the whole thing. Because it's hugely detrimental to employees' well-being also, when they feel this need to be constantly switched on. And when we're working from home, there's also that fear of the work-life boundary blurring, and individuals just not, that can have a huge impact on stress and burnout, and especially going back to kind of caregivers who also have families, and how are they managing through all of this. And so I think trust is, yeah, absolutely, extremely important now.
Very interesting. So, Dr. Sana, how do you, given that we've discussed at length about a bunch of things about vulnerability, about how onboarding should potentially look like in the new world, and a bunch of these things, how would you sum up that into 2 or 3 different top priority things? Given that, look, this is old proverb, right? Old habits die hard, and let's face it, people are still going to take time to adapt to these new changes and even come face to face with the truth alone, right? But what are 3 low effort, high impact things that you would recommend that orgs start doing?
Yeah, I think I think we've not really talked about low effort initiatives. It's been more around kind of building empathy and vulnerability and compassion, which is not kind of low effort. But I think in terms of priorities, and we did go deeper into what we mean by mental health, but I think mental health being a priority is I would say that is a priority. Bringing in mental health initiatives, but when we're talking about mental health, it's about having meaningful, difficult, open conversations amongst teams. I think that is the first thing that I would raise as a priority. I think secondly, a common purpose. I think ensuring that teams feel that common purpose when they are not together in the office is hugely important. And then thirdly, kind of trust building, which I think does link to the first point around having those difficult open conversations. But trust building, I would say, is also about role modeling. And I think if leadership is able to role model the importance of or role model the fact that that they are giving their employees agency, that there is trust, that they will do what do fulfill their responsibilities. I think that is also an important kind of thing for the future for future HR initiative.
Right. And I think that none of this is, coming under a budget, so everybody can do this. you
This is a
know.
super important point actually. Now this is coming under a budget, and I think this is I think the highlight of all of this. Nothing is in a budget. I think everybody can do this. It just takes probably an hour or two out of your week, and to really just make the connect with your employer, or even to even attenuate your conversation in a way that it has more signal than noise in it. That noise being politics, could be ulterior motives, could be all of those things, right?
Exactly. And I think even when we talked about, I didn't bring in the personality aspect, but you mentioned should we bring in kind of personality tests so that managers can really understand their teams. That's the ideal scenario. But even having a conversation, this is what I always advise companies, even have a conversation with your team on what is your preferred working style. What do you expect, like how do you feel in a Zoom meeting of 10 people? Do you feel like speaking up? Do you and having those difficult conversations, you don't need to have a personality test for that. You can just have a conversation. So I think it is a low cost but high impact way of doing this.
Yeah, one of the reasons I actually brought up the entire personality test was that because I was in a cafe. I think last night I was lounging because I was again I really wanted to blow off some steam. So a friend of mine got his laptop. He was writing. He was again writing his book and stuff. And he was like, "Look, why don't you take this personality test?" I'm like, "Okay, look, fine. This is a weird thing to do in a cafe, but let's do this. Why not?" So right, we spent about 40 minutes doing it because apparently you're not supposed to do it alone. You're supposed to do it with another person who helps you become less biased. And so I did with him, and the results were pretty accurate, right? And if I were to drop insights from all of those things, right, I took that INTJ and the other one, I don't remember those tests, and I could actually draw similarities between what the test told to how I perform at work. And then I could actually, so in the appraisal discussion that I have with my managers or anybody, right, I could exactly tell, look, these are my traits inherently that I'm born with. This is what I can tweak. Probably I can write better emails. I could empathize a bit more to the people I work with, to all of those things. But these are things that I can't do because it just doesn't come naturally to me, and that just makes it like a more smooth flowing and a very objective conversation that's not emotionally driven at all. Like, look, this is what it is. uh, Help me out, at the moment.
I think that that's a great way of summarizing it. I think it's about, this is who it's almost as if all of us could share that with each other. Teams could share that with each other, where this is who I am. This is where there's a little bit of stretch and flex that I'm willing to put the effort into, because we are willing to do that. Most of us. And this is what I can't do. And I think if we could all share that, but again, it comes back to the fact that you have to feel that psychological safety, and you have to feel vulnerable enough to be able to share that. So, yeah.
But to me, whenever I've done these personality tests, I feel like I can change. I'm quite chameleon, I think.
That's quite common. I would say you mentioned the MBTI. So from a for personality scientists, that is the kind of least scientific, least valid personality test. And I know it's hugely popular, uh, but every time that people, one of the reasons that it's so kind of low in reliability is that it often, when you do it a second time, you'll often find you're something else, and your work persona is very different to your kind of personal social persona. So yeah, that's an important point to make on the MBTI.
Right.
Agree. I mean, I've never done well on these tests, and I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's for me. Anyway, I think, damn, this usually happens. I forget what I want to say. So yeah, well, we can take that part.
Yeah, so I think so Nisha will wrap up. I think we've had a pretty interesting episode today. Again, Dr. Sana, thanks a lot for getting agreeing to do this with us. Pretty insightful experience, especially not just for us, but for the CHROs. If everybody's going to be listening to this as well, once this episode's out. Again, pretty interesting mental model that you mentioned around establishing safety, establishing vulnerability as as pillars of culture itself, and not as a favor that you're doing to somebody else, so that the emotional burden isn't there. And the moment that this is established, this is set right from the point of hiring, talent acquisition, where you're having open-ended conversations about the kind of strengths and weaknesses a person brings and the kind of personality that he adds, right? Which is what a lot of orgs call culture fit, right? So all of those things to the point of actually having continuous one-on-one conversation and actually sustaining that momentum. I think you mentioned a lot of such wonderful mental models, which again come under no budget, like as Nisha mentioned as well. So I think these are fantastic things that what CHRs can essentially start implementing it. Nisha, do you have any concluding words? Dr. Sana as well, do you have any concluding words?
No, nothing. I think just thank you, Dr. Sana. You've
Perfect. Yeah.
really done, what you've done to me, it's simplified so many things, right? Uh, it's just so brilliantly simplified. I think that's what this conversation to me has been. So genuinely, thank you. If you have any concluding remarks, especially if, we're talking to CHROs, so anything that they should do, and your own experience of having this conversation would be great for us to hear.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. This has been a very enjoyable conversation. And no, I think just in terms of kind of final words, I would just say that this is an opportunity as we come out of this pandemic. And we talked about this. I think this is an opportunity for a refresh and to really look at existing policies and look at the way that we've typically done things with a new lens. And I think we should take that as an opportunity. And so that would be, I think, my takeaway.
Great. So, guys, everyone, thank you for listening in. This is our episode with Dr. Sana on psychological behavior changes that happened before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic as well. Our next episode is going to air a week after this, and I think between them, Nisha and I will be sharing a lot of bite-sized mental models from this conversations on our LinkedIn page. So be sure to check that out and follow the LinkedIn page as well. We are the Edge for CHRO on LinkedIn, exclusively on LinkedIn. So be sure to follow and also like this podcast as well. Do share with your friends and family too. Thanks a lot.